waiting to hear answers before we progress. You know, we're not spending any money in Ukraine. We're selling basically missiles and everything else to NATO, and NATO is paying us, and then they distribute it to who they want. I guess they're mostly distributing to Ukraine, but we're not spending money. But you know what we are? We're spending a lot of time and a lot of effort, because last month 27,000 soldiers were killed. Both, think of it, 27,000. That's, if you take a football game and take half the stadium, that's 27,000. So 27,000 soldiers were killed. Russian and Ukrainian soldiers were killed. And I want to see that stop. We'll find out. Look, there are a lot of things happening right now. A lot of people say it's closer than it's ever been. It's a war that would have never started. If I were president, would have never started. It's a war that should never have started.
Listen to me and listen carefully, because what you just witnessed in that clip is not political theater, and it is not mere bombast, and it is not some aberrational moment of confusion from an aging demagogue, but rather it is the crystallization of everything morally repugnant and intellectual bankrupt about this man's worldview, wrapped up in that characteristic mixture of casual cruelty and transactional sociopathy that has defined his entire political existence. And you need to understand what is happening here, because we are watching in real time as American foreign policy transform into a glorified protection racket, dressed up in the language of deal-making, while thousands upon thousands of human beings are ground into dust beneath the machinery of imperial aggression. Trump stands there and tells you with that distinctive verbal incontinence that the Trump administration's proposed 28-point peace plan would require Ukraine to give up its eastern Donbas region and Crimea and swear off NATO membership, essentially handing Vladimir Putin everything he could have dreamed of on a silver platter, while pretending that this constitutes some kind of diplomatic triumph. And he does it with this folksy comparison of 27,000 dead soldiers to half a football stadium, as if quantifying human carnage through the lens of American sports entertainment somehow makes the horror more comprehensible or more palatable, when in fact it does the exact opposite. It reveals the profound intellectual and moral vacancy at the heart of his entire approach to statecraft. But here is where it gets truly sinister, and you need to pay attention, because Trump's new national security strategy notably avoids criticism of Russia and names Moscow as a perceived existential threat to Europe, but not to the US, and the Kremlin has responded by saying the adjustments correspond in many ways to our vision, which should tell you everything you need to know about whose interests are actually being served here. And when Trump claims in that clip that we are not spending money in Ukraine but rather selling equipment to NATO, who then distributes it, he is engaging in precisely the kind of semantic gymnastics that allows him to reframe American support for a democracy under existential assault as nothing more than a business transaction, a weapons sale, a profit center, stripping away any pretense of moral obligation or strategic necessity or basic human solidarity in favor of this grotesque ledger book mentality, where the only thing that matters is whether America is making money off the deal. This is the commodification of human suffering, elevated to the level of national policy, and it represents everything that is depraved about viewing international relations through the warped lens of Trumpian transactionalism, where alliances are protection rackets and sovereignty is negotiable, and the lives of Ukrainians fighting for their very existence are reduced to line items in some imaginary balance sheet. And we need to talk about what is actually happening right now in December 2025, because Ukraine sent a revised peace plan to Washington, as Trump held a call with European leaders, as both sides scramble to keep efforts on track to end Russia's invasion. And Ukrainian officials tell us that Zelensky faces growing pressure from the US to accept major territorial losses and other concessions in Trump's peace plan, while Kyiv thinks the US is pushing Zelensky much harder than Putin, which exposes the fundamental rot at the core of this entire endeavor, because the American president is applying more coercive pressure on the victim of aggression than on the aggressor himself, more energy spent browbeating Volodymyr Zelensky into accepting the dismemberment of his country than holding Vladimir Putin accountable for launching a war of conquest that has killed tens of thousands and displaced millions and reduced entire cities to rubble. Trump even had the audacity to claim that Zelensky hasn't yet read the proposal. His people love it, but he hasn't. Russia's fine with it. Which is such a transparent manipulation tactic that it would be laughable if the stakes were not so catastrophically high, trying to isolate Zelensky by suggesting his own people are against him, while simultaneously reassuring everyone that Putin, the war criminal, is perfectly content with the arrangement. Let me be absolutely clear about what is being proposed here. because the Trump administration's 28-point framework would require Ukraine to give up its eastern Donbas region and Crimea and swear off NATO membership, and the plan calls for NATO to agree not to send troops to Ukraine, possibly scuttling any post-war security deal that involves placing Allied troops on Ukrainian soil, which means that Ukraine would be forced to surrender approximately 20% of its sovereign territory, including land not even currently occupied by Russian forces, would be permanently barred from the defensive alliance that might actually protect it from future aggression, and would be left vulnerable and exposed with no meaningful security guarantees, while Russia gets to keep its ill-gotten territorial gains and face only the gradual lifting of sanctions as a reward for its barbarism. This is not a peace plan. This is a capitulation dressed up in diplomatic language. This is Munich 1938 reimagined for the 21st century, with Trump playing the role of Chamberlain, except worse, because at least Chamberlain had the excuse of operating before the world fully understood the depths of fascist depravity, whereas Trump is doing this with full knowledge of what Putin is, and what Putin wants, and what Putin will do if given the slightest opening. And the Pope himself has weighed in, because Pope Leo XIV said, seeking a peace agreement without including Europe in the talks is unrealistic, given the war is in Europe, and when even the Vatican is calling out your peace process for excluding the continent where the actual war is being fought, you know something has gone profoundly wrong with your diplomatic approach. But Trump does not care about that, because this entire endeavor is not actually about achieving a just and lasting peace, but rather about engineering a quick exit that allows him to claim victory, regardless of the human cost or strategic consequences. He wants his Nobel Peace Prize, and he wants it now, and he is willing to throw Ukraine under the bus to get it. And the fact that Trump told Politico he's going to have to get on the ball and start accepting things about Zelensky, adding that he's losing the war, reveals the contempt with which he views the Ukrainian president, and by extension the Ukrainian people, treating them not as allies or partners, or even human beings worthy of basic dignity, but as obstacles to his personal ambitions, who need to stop being so difficult and just accept whatever terms Putin and Trump have cooked up between them. Now let us examine the claim about casualty figures, because Trump says in that clip that 27,000 soldiers were killed last month, Russian and Ukrainian combined, and he describes this with that football stadium metaphor, as if he is explaining a concept to children. But here is what you need to know about the actual human cost of this war. The Economist estimated Ukrainian losses at between 60,000 and 100,000 killed and 400,000 wounded, while over 100,000 Russian soldiers were reportedly killed since the beginning of 2025, and these numbers represent not abstract statistics, but actual human beings with families and dreams and futures that were stolen from them by Putin's imperial ambitions, and Trump reduces all of this suffering to a sports venue comparison, as if the appropriate emotional response to mass death, to visualize how many seats in the stands would be empty, rather than to feel rage at the injustice of it, or determination to hold the aggressor accountable, or solidarity with those fighting for their survival. This is sociopathy masquerading as folksy communication, and it tells you everything about Trump's capacity for empathy, which is to say he has none. But the really insidious part, and you need to understand this, is the historical parallel we are witnessing, because we have been here before. We have seen this exact playbook deployed against democracies, facing existential threats from expansionist autocracies. And every single time the appeasers tell us that we are being unrealistic, that we need to accept the reality on the ground, that the alternative is worse, that peace at any price is preferable to continued conflict, and every single time they are catastrophically wrong, because dictators do not stop when you give them what they want. They escalate, they probe for more weakness, they interpret accommodation as invitation, and Putin has already demonstrated this pattern, because he took Crimea in 2014, and the 14, West did essentially nothing, and so he came back for more in 2022, and if we allow him to consolidate these gains through a sham peace process, he will absolutely come back for more again, because that is what aggressive autocrats do when they learn that aggression works. Trump's claim that the new document rejects the idea that NATO should be a perpetually expanding alliance, which is just what Moscow wants to hear, as the Kremlin has often declared NATO's eastward expansion as its chief security concern, is giving Putin a veto over the security arrangements of sovereign nations, and validating his propaganda about NATO encirclement, when the actual history shows that NATO expanded because countries that had lived under Russian domination were desperate for protection from future Russian aggression, and they were right to seek that protection, as subsequent events have abundantly demonstrated. Let me walk you through what Trump's transactional approach to Ukraine actually represents in terms of the broader architecture of American power and moral authority, because when he says we are selling equipment to NATO and they are paying us and we are not spending money, he is fundamentally misunderstanding or deliberately misrepresenting how alliances work and why they matter, because NATO gives the US the global bedrock of legitimacy, support for the dollar and the post-Soviet hegemony it thrives upon, meaning that American investment in the security of allied nations is not charity and it is not a loss leader, but rather the foundation of American influence and prosperity, the thing that makes the dollar the global reserve currency and American financial markets the deepest in the world, and American corporations able to operate with relative security across multiple continents. But Trump cannot see past the immediate transaction, that cannot comprehend that sometimes you invest in relationships and institutions and principles because they pay dividends over time in ways that are not immediately quantifiable on a quarterly earnings report. And this myopia is not just stupid policy, it is dangerous policy, because it signals to every ally and partner that America under Trump views them not as partners in a common project, but as clients in a protection racket who better keep their payments up to date or risk abandonment. The Trump White House said in its newly published national security strategy that the U.S. is at odds with its European allies in NATO over their unrealistic expectations for the Ukraine war, and sharply criticized them for subversion of democratic processes, which is genuinely staggering in its audacity, because Trump, who attempted to overturn American democratic processes in 2021, is now lecturing European democracies about democratic backsliding. Trump, who has praised dictators from Kim Jong-un to Viktor Orban, is suddenly concerned about threats to democracy in Europe, and the cognitive dissonance would be amusing if it were not so terrifying, because what Trump is actually doing is laying the rhetorical groundwork for abandoning Ukraine by claiming that Europe is too weak, or too corrupt, or too undemocratic to deserve American support, deflecting attention from his own complicity in appeasing Putin by attacking the allies who have actually shown courage in standing up to Russian aggression. Russia is spared similar criticism and deemed a relationship worthy of strategic stability, as the U.S. is cast not as a NATO ally to Europe, but a mediator to mitigate the risk of conflict between Russia and European states, which repositions America from leader of the Democratic Alliance to neutral arbiter between democracies and their autocratic adversary, a fundamental betrayal of everything the transatlantic partnership has stood for since 1945. The current situation is reaching a critical inflection point because Trump's envoys have given Zelensky just days to decide whether to accept the U.S. plan, which would require Ukraine to cede territory to Russia in exchange for unspecified security guarantees, and those security guarantees are unspecified for a reason, because they will be worthless, because what good is an American security guarantee when the American president has already demonstrated his willingness to abandon allies the moment it becomes politically convenient, when he has already shown that he views treaty obligations as suggestions rather than commitments, when his entire foreign policy is predicated on the idea that everything is negotiable, including the sovereignty and survival of nations that have relied on American promises. Zelensky understands this, which is why Zelensky reiterated Monday that Ukraine would not cede land to Russia, saying we have no legal right under Ukrainian law, under our constitution, under international law, and honestly we have no moral right either, because he recognizes that accepting territorial concessions would not end the war, but merely postpone the next phase of Russian aggression, while leaving Ukraine weaker and more vulnerable, and more isolated than before. We need to talk about the asymmetry of pressure being applied here, because the revised version of the plan was rejected by Russian President Vladimir Putin in talks last week, yet Trump has focused his latest pressure campaign on Zelensky, which reveals the fundamental perversity of this entire diplomatic effort, because the aggressor gets to reject proposals without consequence, while the victim gets threatened and cajoled and browbeaten into accepting terms that amount to national suicide. And this is what appeasement looks like in practice. This is what happens when the leader of the free world decides that managing the politics of ending a war is more important than ensuring the war ends justly, when short-term political expediency trumps long-term strategic thinking and moral clarity. Trump wants this done before Christmas or before some other arbitrary deadline, so he can declare mission accomplished and move on to the next spectacle, while Ukraine is left to deal with the consequences of its forced capitulation for generations to come. And then there is Trump's grotesque claim that the war would never have started if he were president, which is such an epic self-serving distortion of reality that it deserves its own analysis, because what Trump actually did during his presidency was withhold military aid to Ukraine in an attempt to extort political dirt on his rivals. He legitimized Putin at every opportunity. He questioned NATO commitments. He praised authoritarian governance. He created exactly the kind of permissive environment that would embolden a dictator like Putin to believe he could invade a neighboring country without facing serious consequences from the West. The idea that Putin looked at Trump's presidency and thought, "I better not invade Ukraine because this guy is so tough," is laughable on its face when the actual record shows Trump constantly deferring to Putin, believing Putin over his own intelligence agencies, meeting with Putin without American note-takers present, advocating for Russia's readmission to the G8, all signals that America under Trump would not mount serious resistance to Russian aggression. Putin waited until after Trump left office, not because Trump was a deterrent, but because Trump's chaotic presidency had already done significant damage to NATO cohesion and transatlantic unity, and Putin wanted to see if those trends would continue under Biden before launching his invasion. The football stadium metaphor that Trump uses deserves additional scrutiny because it represents a particular kind of American provinciality where everything foreign must be translated into domestic terms that American audiences can supposedly understand, as if Americans are incapable of processing the meaning of large numbers without reference to sports venues. And this is not harmless folksy communication. It is a form of intellectual condescension that treats serious matters of war and peace as entertainment, that reduces geopolitical tragedy to the level of a game day comparison, and it reflects Trump's own limited imaginative and moral horizons, his inability or unwillingness to engage with human suffering except through the mediating lens of American consumer culture. 27,000 dead soldiers are not half a football stadium. They are 27,000 individual human tragedies, 27,000 families destroyed, 27,000 futures extinguished, and they deserve better than to be used as props in Trump's verbal performance art. What we are witnessing is the potential collapse of the entire post-Cold War security architecture in Europe, being engineered by an American president who fundamentally does not understand or value that architecture, who sees alliances as transactional arrangements rather than mutual commitments grounded in shared values and common interests. And the consequences of this collapse will reverberate for decades, because if America abandons Ukraine after encouraging it to resist Russian aggression, if we force Ukraine into a humiliating peace that rewards Putin's violence, then every other country in Russia's neighborhood will draw the obvious conclusion, which is that American security guarantees are worthless, and they better either cut their own deals with Moscow or develop their own nuclear weapons, because they certainly cannot rely on Washington to protect them when the going gets tough. This will lead to nuclear proliferation, regional instability, emboldened autocrats everywhere, who will have learned that the democratic world lacks the resolve to defend its proclaimed values, and a massive diminution of American influence and credibility that will take generations to rebuild if it can be rebuilt at all. Trump's new national security strategy stunned Washington's allies, casting doubt on the entire post-Cold War security order in Europe, taking direct shots at the EU and questioning main principles of NATO. And this is not normal policy disagreement or routine alliance management, but rather a fundamental repudiation of 7 decades of American strategic thinking about Europe's role in global security and prosperity, and it is happening at precisely the moment when that security order faces its greatest test since 1945, when Putin is actively trying to overturn the post-Cold War settlement by force, when China is watching carefully to see if the West has the stomach to defend the principle that borders cannot be changed through military conquest. Trump is sending a clear signal that America will not defend that principle, that might makes right, that aggression pays if you are patient enough and brutal enough and willing to outlast Western attention spans. And this is a historic betrayal not just of Ukraine, but of the entire architecture of international order, that has prevented great power war and enabled unprecedented prosperity for nearly 80 years. The clip shows Trump claiming that a lot of people say the situation is closer to resolution than ever before, which is the kind of vague sourcing he always uses when he wants to make claims he cannot substantiate. And the reality is, the prospects of an imminent peace agreement seem dim as tensions rise between Trump and Zelensky, because you cannot engineer lasting peace by pressuring the victim to accept the perpetrator's demands. You cannot create stability by validating territorial conquest. You cannot build security by abandoning the principle of sovereignty. And anyone with even a rudimentary understanding of history knows this. But Trump either does not know it or does not care, because his entire focus is on engineering a quick political win, regardless of whether it actually solves the underlying problem or merely postpones the inevitable next crisis. What is so morally repugnant about Trump's entire approach is the way it treats Ukrainian lives as expendable variables in an equation designed to serve his political interests, the way he can talk about 27,000 dead soldiers and then immediately pivot to how he would have prevented the war if only he had been president, making it all about him even as he pretends to be moved by the human toll, And this narcissistic inability to see beyond his own reflected image is not just a character flaw, it is a categorical disqualification from leadership, because leadership requires the capacity to prioritize collective welfare over personal aggrandizement, to make decisions based on principle rather than convenience, to maintain commitments even when they become costly or complicated. Trump possesses none of these qualities, and we are seeing the consequences play out in real time as he tries to trade Ukrainian territory for a photo opportunity with Putin that he can call a peace summit. And we cannot ignore the domestic political context here, because Trump is doing this while facing his own legal and political vulnerabilities, while trying to consolidate power and deflect attention from various scandals and failures, and foreign policy becomes a tool for changing the subject, for looking presidential, for claiming achievements regardless of whether those achievements actually benefit American interests or advance American values. The Ukraine situation gives him an opportunity to play deal-maker on the world stage, to posture as the master negotiator who can solve intractable problems through sheer force of personality. Never mind that the deal he is negotiating is disastrous, and the personality he is bringing to bear is toxic, and the whole enterprise is fundamentally corrupt from inception to execution. This is not diplomacy, this is performance, and the audience Trump cares about is not the international community, or America's allies, or even the American people broadly conceived, but rather his base of supporters who want to see him stick it to the elites and the experts and the foreign policy establishment, regardless of whether sticking it to them actually makes the world safer or America more secure. The historical moment we are living through will be studied for generations as a case study in how democracies fail themselves, how publics can be persuaded to abandon their own values and interests through a combination of exhaustion and manipulation and carefully cultivated cynicism, because that is what Trump is counting on, the hope that Americans and Europeans are so tired of hearing about Ukraine, so worn down by inflation and domestic political polarization and a general sense of crisis fatigue, that they will accept whatever deal he brokers just to make the issue go away, even if that deal plants the seeds for future catastrophes. This is governance by lowest common denominator, appealing to the basest impulses of democratic electorates, their desire for simplicity and closure and the illusion of control, and it works right up until it doesn't, right up until the consequences of short-term thinking come due, and we find ourselves facing threats that could have been prevented if we had maintained our commitments and defended our principles when it still mattered. What Trump is proposing is not peace, but the temporary absence of active combat purchased through the betrayal of a democratic nation that relied on Western support, and history teaches us that such arrangements do not last because they are built on foundations of coercion and capitulation rather than genuine resolution of underlying conflicts, and when they inevitably collapse, the resulting violence is often worse than what came before, because the interval of false peace has been used by aggressors to consolidate their gains and prepare for the next offensive. Putin will use any ceasefire not to build lasting peace, but to rearm, to rebuild depleted forces, to tighten his grip on occupied territories, to continue his campaign of cultural genocide against Ukrainian identity in the regions under Russian control, and then when he judges the moment propitious he will strike again, perhaps at Ukraine, perhaps at Moldova, perhaps at the Baltics, testing whether the West has learned anything from its earlier failures, or whether it will simply repeat the cycle of appeasement and betrayal that has characterized so much of its response to authoritarian aggression. Listen to how Trump talks about NATO in that clip, how he frames it as this arrangement where they distribute equipment to who they want, with this casual dismissiveness, as if the alliance is some kind of opaque bureaucracy rather than a defensive pact among democracies committed to mutual security, and this reveals his fundamental misunderstanding of what NATO actually is and why it matters, because NATO is not a charity operation where America generously provides weapons to ungrateful Europeans. NATO is the institutional embodiment of the principle that democracies must stand together against autocratic aggression, because separately they are vulnerable but collectively they are strong, and undermining that principle through rhetoric that portrays NATO as a protection racket or a one-sided deal where America gets taken advantage of is doing Putin's work for him, advancing Russian strategic objectives by sowing discord within the alliance and encouraging members to doubt whether the mutual defense commitment actually means anything. Trump has been doing this for years, and the damage accumulates over time, each disparaging comment about NATO, each threat to abandon allies who do not meet spending targets, each public display of contempt for European leaders chips away at the credibility and cohesion that makes deterrence work, and you cannot rebuild that credibility quickly once it has been shattered, because allies need to believe you will be there in a crisis, and if you have spent years signaling that you view them as burdens rather than partners, why would they believe your assurances when the crisis actually arrives? The really sinister brilliance of Trump's rhetorical strategy is the way he preemptively frames any criticism of his Ukraine policy as unrealistic idealism from people who do not understand the art of the deal, who want to prolong the war for their own purposes, who are not serious about peace, and this framing makes it difficult to oppose his approach without being cast as warmonger or naive interventionist or someone who does not care about the human cost of continued fighting. But this is a false framing, because the real choice is not between Trump's peace plan and endless war. The real choice is between a just peace that provides Ukraine with genuine security guarantees and preserves the principle that territorial conquest will not be rewarded, versus a false peace that legitimizes aggression and guarantees future conflict, and refusing to accept that false binary is not warmongering, it is moral clarity and strategic wisdom, and the basic recognition that some things are worth defending even when defending them is difficult and expensive and politically complicated. Ukrainian sovereignty is worth defending. The principle of territorial integrity is worth defending. The idea that democracies should stand together against autocratic aggression is worth defending, and we diminish ourselves morally and strategically when we abandon those principles in pursuit of the quick fix that Trump is peddling. Every word out of Trump's mouth in that clip drips with this transactional logic where the only question that matters is whether we are making or losing money, whether we are getting a good deal, whether the other side is taking advantage of us, and this is the worldview of a real estate developer who sees everything as a zero-sum negotiation, where you win by making sure the other guy loses, but international relations and collective security do not work that way, because often the best outcomes are the ones where everyone gains something, where investments in stability pay dividends for all parties, where maintaining principled commitments creates an environment in which cooperation becomes possible and trust can develop over time. Trump cannot think in these terms, because his entire life has been defined by viewing every interaction as a contest where there must be a winner and a loser, and the only thing that matters is making sure you are the winner, regardless of the long-term consequences or the damage done to relationships or the precedents set for future interactions. This might work in certain narrow business contexts, though Trump's actual business record suggests it does not even work there, but it is catastrophic as an approach to foreign policy, because in foreign policy the goal is not to win negotiations, but to build durable arrangements that serve national interests over time, and that requires thinking beyond quarterly results and immediate gratification and the superficial optics of looking tough or making deals. The fact that Trump can stand there and casually propose forcing Ukraine to surrender 20% of its territory, to abandon its NATO aspirations, to accept vague unspecified security guarantees from an American president who has demonstrated repeatedly that his word means nothing, and present this as a reasonable peace plan rather than a transparent betrayal, tells you everything about the moral universe he inhabits, which is one devoid of principle or consistency, or any conception of international relations beyond crude power dynamics and personal advantage. And the really terrifying thing is that he might actually pull this off. He might actually succeed in pressuring Zelensky into accepting these terms through a combination of military exhaustion and diplomatic isolation and the looming threat of complete American abandonment. And if he does, it will be celebrated by his supporters as a masterful diplomatic achievement, even as it plants the seeds for catastrophes that will dwarf the current crisis in scope and consequence, because the lesson every autocrat will draw from Ukraine's forced capitulation is that the democratic world is weak and divided and lacks the stomach for sustained resistance to aggression, and that lesson will embolden them to push further and harder in the absolute certainty that eventually the West will fold, because the West always folds when things get difficult. We are at a hinge point in history, and the decisions made in the next few weeks about Ukraine's future will shape the trajectory of international politics for decades to come, and Donald Trump, through a combination of ignorance and malice and pathological self-interest, is steering us toward disaster while pretending to be the only adult in the room, the only one tough enough and smart enough to make the hard choices, when in reality he is making the easy choice, the cowardly choice, the choice that sacrifices long-term security for short-term political advantage, that trades principle for expediency, that values the appearance of success over the substance of justice, and we will all pay the price for this betrayal in ways we cannot yet fully comprehend, but which history will record with terrible clarity when scholars look back on this moment and ask how the leader of the free world could have gotten it so catastrophically wrong when the stakes were so desperately high and the moral choice was so blindingly clear.